Hey everybody, this is Robert from Contentful, and today I'm going to show you how you can get started building ASP.NET Core applications with our new .NET SDK. So here I am in Visual Studio. I have created a brand new ASP.NET Core web app. I've got it up and running over here in Chrome. And as you can see, it's just a standard template. And I'll be switching a little bit back and forth here between Visual Studio and Chrome as we go along building this application. And for the purposes of this demonstration, I'm using the product example space in Contentful that I also have open here in Chrome. And if you wish to follow along in building the application, you can just create a new space in Contentful and select the products template, and then make sure to replace all of the access token and configurations with your own values. Okay, so let's get started. The first thing we need to do here is we need to install the NuGet package for the Contentful.NET SDK. And note here that since we're building an ASP.NET Core application, we will be using the Contentful.ASP.NET Core package. And this is a package that in turn references the complete SDK package, which is called Contentful.C#. But this also includes a number of nice features specifically for ASP.NET Core applications. And you might also notice here that we're running with the pre-flag since the package is still in beta. And this does not mean that there's no support for it. There's still 100% official support. Okay, let's run this. Installing, and there we go. Now we have the package. Now we also need to tell our application which space to pull content from and which access token to use. And this is most simply done by adding some application settings. So we'll open app-settings.json here. And I will paste a couple of settings in here. There we go. Okay, so what we've done here is we've added the Contentful options, and specifically we've added the delivery API key, which is the access token to fetch content with, and the space ID here, which is the space that we want to get content from. And you can easily find these in your own web application by just going over here, APIs, and here's my demonstration key. And here you can find the space ID, and here you can find your access token. Okay, and now we need to do one more final thing to get everything set up. And we'll open up our startup.cs file here. And we'll add to our services down here. Here we're adding MVC, and we also need to add services.add_contentful. And we need to pass it the configuration. And of course it says it doesn't find this because we need to add our using statement. There we go. And that's it. This is all you need to get up and running with ASP.NET Core and Contentful. All the needed services are now registered, and we can start consuming our content. And in our case, since we're using the products template, we have a number of products that we probably want to display. So I'm going to go over here and I'm going to create a products controller. Products controller. And we'll inherit from controller here. And let's create an index action. And let's return view from here. Right, and so one thing is still missing here. We need a view as well, so let's add that. New folder, products, and let's just copy the about view here down there and rename it to index. And let's just remove everything from in here. We can actually rename that to products and just go our products. There we go. Now we would expect /products in our application to return our newly created view here. Okay, so that was very, very basic. How do we now get some contentful content in there? Well, let's go back to Visual Studio here. The first thing we need is we need a contentful client, which is the class that we use to interact with the Contentful Delivery API. And like I mentioned earlier, the use contentful method that we used here, or add contentful method, sorry, has already wired everything up for us. So all we need to do now in the controller is we need to, in the constructor, require our iContentful client. Like this. And let's add a private field also. There we go. And now we have a reference to iContentful client, and we can use that in our index action down here to start fetching content from Contentful. And we can see here that we have a number of different methods to choose from. And in our case, let's use the getEntries method. And you'll notice that this method is generic, and that is because it's actually asking you what type you want returned from the method. So if we go object here, for example, and let's call this entries, we'll notice that this is actually an IEnumerable of object that is returned now. And this means that we can control the type of object we deserialize the contentful JSON response into. And there is a class available in the SDK that we can use out of the box, which is called entry. So we could go entry here. But that class is also generic, because it needs to know how to serialize its fields. So we could just go object or dynamic here, for example, for simplicity. And using contentful.core.models. And this is perfectly okay. But the method is also asynchronous, which means that if we do this, the entries are actually a task of IEnumerable and entry dynamic. Which is not what we want, of course. To call an async method, we need to use the await keyword, like so. But then we get another error, which says that the await operator can only be used within an async method. Consider marking this method with the async modifier and changing its return type to task iActionResult. So let's do that. There we go. Now, this is the prettiest, wrapping all your code in async and await and task and stuff, but it's actually very important that we keep our calls to the Contentful backend async, because they're doing HTTP requests in the background, and if we didn't do them async, then we'd actually be blocking our thread until the response has been returned, which is, of course, very wasteful. All calls with the Contentful client are async, and we need to adapt our code slightly to that fact. Alright, but I'm still not quite happy with this. I'd much rather use my own models here than this enter dynamic thing. So let's create a model. Let's go over here and create a new folder, models, and let's add a class that we call product in there. There we go. And let's create a property here that we call product name. Right. And let's use that in our action here instead. So let's go product and add a using statement, and let's actually return this to the view as well. Okay, so let's go back to our view and make sure that we add that as a model here as well. IEnumerable of product. Actually, web application 18.models.product. And let's just for each all of these. For each product and model. And let's put this in some kind of a UL list here. Like that. And let's go product dot product name. Okay, and let's see what our view looks like now. Okay, so that's interesting. We've got a couple of products here. But we also got a bunch of blanks here. And now why is that? Well, if we go back to our controller here, we just called get entries. And now that is all of the entries, not just the products. So let's filter this down and say that we only want entries of the type of products. And if we look at this method here, we can see that there are two overloads here. One that accepts a string query string, and one that accepts a query builder. And query builder is a class in the .NET SDK that you can use to create filtering queries for your calls to the Contentful backend. So let's create a query builder up here. There we go. And Query Builder has a fluent interface, so you can chain filtering calls together. Something like this. Content type is something. Field equals field greater than, etc. But this is not what we need right now. right now we only need to filter by content type. And as you can see here, we actually need to provide a content type ID. And where can we find that? Well, again, it's easiest to just go back to our web app here and find that. If we go to the product content type here, we'll see that we can find the ID up here directly in the URL, or we can go to the JSON preview here, and if we scroll down a little bit, we'll find it as well. There's the ID. So we'll just copy that, go back here and paste that in, and now if we have a look, we should just be getting our products back. If we pass that query builder to our method as well, of course. And as you can see now, we can actually get rid of this because that is inferred from the query builder. Okay, so let's try that again. Okay, so that's nice. But how does that actually work? So let's have a look at our product class here again. It has right now just a single property, product name. Could we actually change that to anything? Like if we change this to name, would that work? Well, we need to update our view, of course. And as we can see, that doesn't work anyway, because there is no property name on our product content type in Contentful. If we look over here, we have product name, we have slug description, etc., but we have no name property. But if we really want it to be named name in our C# class, we can actually achieve that too, because the Contentful SDK leverages Newtonsoft.json behind the scenes. So we could just add a JSON property attribute to our class over here, like something like that, and add a using statement. And this tells from which JSON property we want to deserialize this C# property. And now if we go back and have a look again, we should be back to working, hopefully. And there we are. So the SDK is, or actually Newtonsoft.json is smart enough to just serialize properties by name directly. So we should be able to add, what did we have here? Slug, for example, as a property. Let's try that. String slug. And let's see if we try to output that here. Product.slug. And let's have a look. And there's our slug, so that works as well. So let's add, what do we have next? Let's add description as well. String description. Description, like that. And it still doesn't work. That's kind of weird. We know that we had a description field in our content type over here. Let's have a look again. Right? But if we go into settings here, we can see that the ID of the field is actually product description. So either we need to name our property product description, or we need to add a JSON property attribute again to make sure the SDK knows how to deserialize this field. So either rename this or add another JSON property like this. And let's go back to our application again and have a look. And there we go. Okay, so that's good, but we have another couple of interesting properties here on our content type. For example, we have an image here, or actually it's many files, but it's still called image. It's a collection of assets in Contentful. And how do we handle that? Well, there is a class in the SDK that is called asset. So we could just use that. It encapsulates everything about an asset in Contentful. And most simply and intuitively, we would just create a list of assets here. Something like that. And using contentful.core.models. And of course, call this image as it was called in Contentful. Okay, so that's a couple of images. Let's see if we can output that here as well. So let's create an image tag maybe. And with the source of product.image, and this was a list, so we'll go first here. And file. As you can see here, there are a number of properties available here that we can use. There's the description of the asset, there's the title, but for now let's just go file URL so that we output something. There we go. Let's have a look at this. And we get our images. They're kind of big. And we could now also actually leverage the image API that Contentful provides directly here by just adding some query string values here, like width equals 150, for example. And if we go back here, we'll see that we get the images now automatically resized to a max width of 150 pixels. And now this is okay, but there's a better way. There's actually a tag helper available that we can use to display assets from Contentful. And as you might know, tag helpers are a new concept in ASP.NET Core where you can extend or even create your own tags that can be processed by Razor and then turned into real HTML, so to speak. And for example, if we have a look at our layout file here, layout.cshtml, we can see that there are a number of tag helpers already in here. Like this one, environment is one, and we can also see down here that the ASP area, ASP controller, ASP action, those are also tag helpers. And not only can we use those tag helpers that Microsoft provides, but we can also create our own, and that's what we've done in the .NET SDK. But to use them, we first need to register them. And to do that, we open the view imports file here. And we can see that here's the Microsoft one already registered, and we'll just add ours as well. So add tag helper, and we'll say everything from contentful.asp.NET Core. And now we can go back to our view again, and we can just remove this and instead replace it with our contentful image. And we can go URL equals the URL from up here, so something like that, and width equals 150. And remove that one. And if we run this now, we'll get the exact same result back. And back to Visual Studio again, we can either provide a URL here, or we can actually provide an asset ID if we would like. So the ID of an asset if you don't have the URL. The URL is slightly more efficient, as the tag helper does not have to call the Contentful API to fetch the asset and then work with the URL. Instead, it can just work with the URL directly. So that's preferred if you have the URL available. And there should be IntelliSense here as well. So there should be IntelliSense to show you all of the different properties available. But unfortunately, this does not yet work with Visual Studio 2017. But it's in the works, so it'll work once it's officially released. And that would of course be an even nicer experience, where you could just go control space here and you get a list of all the different properties for this tag helper that you have available. And a few of the properties are even enumerations, like resize behavior, for example, we'll be using. It's actually an enumeration, so if I went control space here, I would actually get the possible values directly in my editor. But I'm going to paste a few more values in here. So let's add these properties: width and height and resize behavior, and in this case I'm using pad. That's to tell the image API how to resize an image that doesn't fit into these constraints here. And background color, and the background color is just basically telling the image API how, when we pad an image to make sure it fits into the 200 by 200 ratio, what background color should we add to that padding. And let's save that, and let's have a look again here. And there we are. And as you can see here, this image and this image down here didn't need any padding at all. But these two on the top did. On the top and bottom, and on the left and on the right. And if we go back to our view here and just change this to something else, we'll see the colors just changing quickly as well. And as you can see, it's pretty fast, and it's also optimizing this images through the API. So the images returned here are actually exactly 200 by 200, and that's taken care of on the server side. So this means that an editor can just upload an image in whatever aspect ratio they want, and you can then, as the application developer, make sure that the image fits exactly in the layout that you have. Okay, so that was linking assets. We also had a few other interesting properties here on our product content type. Tags here, for example, which is a list of short text. So if we wanted to serialize that, we just go into our product here and we add a property like a list of strings, tags. And let's add that to our view here and see if that works. So this is another for each, of course. Tag in product.tags. Let's just output the tag for now. And let's have a look at that. Yeah, not very pretty, but there they are. Okay, so let's have a look again and see if we had any other interesting properties here. So we have the reference properties here. We have the brand, which is a reference to another entry, and we have the categories, which is references to many other entries, one or more. Well, we could, of course, just create a property here in products, something like entry dynamic brand. But we would, of course, also for these classes want to use our own, or these content types also want to use our own classes. So let's create a brand and a category model here. Brand. Let's copy that. Call that category. Category. And I'm just going to paste a couple of properties in here, so not to bore you with writing all of these properties out. But all of these are, of course, available in the content type, as you can imagine. So now we expect to be able to change this brand property into a brand instead, like that. And then in our view, maybe go something like this. Brand name is product.brand.company name. So let's see if this works. Unfortunately, it doesn't. And to understand why this doesn't work, we really have to look just a little bit closer at the JSON response that we get from Contentful. And I have that open right here. We're basically making this request right now. This is our space ID, this is our access token, and then we're saying, and this content type. So that's our product's content type. And we can see here that we're getting 4 items back. And if we have a quick look at the first item here and look at the fields down here, here's the fields for the entry. And let's go find our brand property somewhere down here. There we go, brand. And we can see here that it only actually contains a sys property, so only some system data around it. So what type it is and the ID of the referenced entry. So none of the fields here. But fortunately, Contentful automatically resolves such links for us, and they can be found a little bit further down here in the includes section of the JSON response. So let's see if we can find that. There we have includes and an array that is called entry. So in here we should be able to find that ID. So here it is. These are all the referenced entries. And now we could remove these from the JSON response if we have no use for them by setting another parameter up here that's called include. If we'd set that 0, we will notice that the include section is entirely gone from the response. And we could also increase it to like 4 to tell the Contentful API to return 4 levels of referenced content. And you can of course also do this using our query builder class that we were looking at just previously. However, in our case, the references that we need are already there, so we really don't need to add anything. We can just go with the normal request here. But we need to let the SDK know how we want the references handled. And this is done by using another attribute on the brand class. a JSON converter. And this basically tells the SDK that if you stumble upon a brand that doesn't contain any fields, just try to find that entry down in the include section instead and use those fields when deserializing. Okay, so let's go back to Visual Studio here and go to our brand, and we'll add this attribute here. JSON converter, and the type is entry field JSON converter. And we can do the same for our category as well, because we'll be using that the same way. And this can be easy to forget at times. But keep in mind that if you reference a class from another entry, then you need to add this entry field JSON converter. Okay, so let's have a look and see if this actually works now. We should be able to get our brand names out here, hopefully. There. Now, this is all good, but if we had a look at our response here, we can see that there's also a sys object here. These are all down here are our fields, which is the content that you create in Contentful, and up here is the system metadata. So this is the sys object that contains a lot of useful information. For example, the ID of the entry, when it was created, when it was last updated. And to get a hold of these properties, we can add another property to our product class. So let's go do that. Product. The system properties class is another class from the Contentful .NET SDK, which just encapsulates all of the properties of the sys object. And we could rename this from sys to something else by using a JSON property if we would like to. But now we should be able to get the ID, for example. If we want to get a hold of the ID of the entry, we could do that something like this. ID product.sys.id. And here we can see the ID of each individual entry. Now this design leaves a lot to be desired, but I've prepared something that at least looks slightly better. Let me just copy and paste some simple HTML in here. Back to Visual Studio. There we go. And we did not call that system properties, we called that sys. There we go. And let's have a look. There. Now we have a products page. The next step would be to implement some kind of details view for each product. Preferably that you get to by clicking read more here maybe. So let's create that. Let's go back to our controller. First we create an action just like the other one. It needs to be async. Action result details and an ID. We can just copy this part down here. And say that we will want only where the ID sys.id equals whatever we pass into this method, something like that. And we actually only want the first entry in that collection. So let's rename this to entry. There. And then let's create the view for this one as well. So let's copy the index one here and let's just call this details. And I'm again just gonna copy some HTML in here. We need to call that web application at.models.product. There we go. Oh, and I need to add a couple of more properties to the product class as well. So I'm just going to do that real quick as well. There we go. And now, hopefully, we should be able to navigate to our details view. So, there we go. But this URL up here isn't the prettiest in the world. We probably don't want to use the ID in the URL like this. And this is why we have the slug field in our content type. So let's change it to that to get a little prettier URL. So if we go over here to our index file, we change from sysid here to slug. And then we need to go over to our controller again and change that we do no longer want to go for the sysid, we want to go for the slug. Something like that. Let's go back here. And if we now click the read more link here, we'll see that we get a details whisk beater instead, which is much nicer. Keep in mind though that this part here is now case sensitive. So these two URLs are not the same. We got a 404 for this one. And this is because field equality in Contentful is case sensitive. So a simple way to fix this in our case would be to just make sure that the slug that we provide, or the ID that we provide here, is always in lowercase, and we should be fine. So now this should work. And it does. Perfect. Okay, so now we have a products view and we have our details view for each product. Another thing that we probably want is to be able to click on the tags down here and go to some view where you'll see all the products with that tag. That's a pretty common scenario. Okay, so how would we do that? Well, we'd obviously need a new action. So let's create one. And let's call it by tag. And just copy this down here because we'll basically be doing the same thing. Or actually this one is even better. And let's add a field equals here, because it turns out field equals is smart enough to work with lists of data as well. So we can just go f.tags let's make sure we go to lower here as well. Or actually not, because the tag might not be in lowercase. And in this case, we don't really need to create a view. We can just reuse the index view. So let's see how that works. Kitchen, accessories, flowers. Perfect. And another thing we'd want is a list of all of our categories. And this should be fairly straightforward by now. Let's just add another action here. Call it categories. Whoopsie. And we'll just again copy all of this. But let's replace our ID here, right, with our categories ID. And let's rename that to categories as well. And make sure that this is no longer a product. This is a category that we want returned. There we go. And then we need a view as well. So let's just copy this one. Call that, oops, call that categories. And this is no longer a product, but a category. And I prepared another HTML snippet here. It's a very simple one. Let's see if this works now. Should be able to go /categories up here now. There we go. Toys, home and kitchen. Of course, we haven't implemented these views yet. So let's go back here and into our product controller, and let's create a by category action. And I prepared a little snippet here like that. And here we're actually doing it a little bit differently. We're getting all of the products, and then we're using plain old link down here, products where, to get all the products and then filter down to the ones where the title equals the category name that we pass in. And again, we return the index view that's already available. And I just wanted to show you that this is also a perfectly valid approach to getting your categories. So let's see if this works now. I'll need to save this as well, of course. Now it should work. So there we go. Okay. So one last thing that would be nice to have would be a brands controller, maybe, to display all of the brands, which is our last content type. If we go back to products here, we can, or to our Contentful web app here, we can see that we had 3 different content types, and we have now implemented product and category. So now we have brands left. So let's create one. Add new controller up here. And let's call it that brands controller. And I'm not going to bore you here again by writing more boilerplate code. I'm just going to copy a little snippet in here. So let's just, actually we can take all of that, just remove that. There we go. And add some using statements. Okay, so remember here that we need to get a reference to the iContentful client, and we can do that directly in the constructor like this. Then I've added two actions down here. One for the index to list all of the brands, and one to get the details for a specific brand. Oh, it appears I've forgotten to add a property to the brand here. So let's go do that. Prop system properties process. And now that's fine. And this looks, of course, very familiar by now. So let's just add a couple of views here as well for those two actions. Brands. And let's copy the about view because it's a simple one. And let's call that index. Index and oopsie, details. There we go. And I'm just gonna paste a couple of simple little snippets in here. And we call this web app models.add. And the same should go for the details view. Models rad. There we go. And let's now go back here and see if we get anything by going /brands. We have our brands, and if we click on one, we should be able to get the details for that brand. Very well. Okay, so let's just update our layout a little bit here to reflect the new controllers that we have. Let's go to our layout and let's just place this part like that. And now we can switch between products, categories, and brands. And we can navigate by tag. We could look at the details of a specific product. We can go look at the brands, and we can filter by a specific category. So that's a very, very simple products application. And if we now go over to our Contentful web app and update a property here for one of our entries, let's look at the clock here, for example. Let's change that to updated and publish that. So there it is, published, and now it's propagating to all of our Edge CDN servers around the world, and that can take a few moments, but it should eventually show up here once we refresh this page. So there we go. And we could add or remove tags or change images and publish, and in just a few moments this will have propagated and we would have a new image and new tags. Pretty straightforward content management, really. Another thing that I wanted to show you today is how you can work with webhooks in the .NET SDK. And webhooks, for those of you that haven't heard of it, is a simple but very clever concept of allowing an application to register a callback URL that will be called when certain events occur. And in the Contentful web application, we can register webhooks for many different events. So let's start there. Let's go over here, and under settings here, we'll find our webhooks. And right now we do not have any, so let's create one. Add webhook. And here you can see what it looks like when you create a webhook. You give it a name. So let's just call that first webhook or something. And then you give it a URL. And this URL is the URL that will be called when this specific event occurs. So it would be something like http yourapplication.com/webhook maybe. And then you can add a username and a password using HTTP basic authentication. And you can also provide a couple of custom headers if you want to, that will be added to the request when they call your webhook. And then we have a choice down here to select which events should actually trigger this webhook. And by default it says all events. But if we switch to only selected events, we can see that you can fine-tune this quite a bit. We could, for example, say that we only want to trigger this webhook for entry events, or only specific entry events like a published entry or an unpublished entry, or and this will then make sure that our configured URL up here is only called when those specific events occur. Okay, but how do we set up our .NET application to be able to accept this webhook we just configured? Well, the simplest approach would probably be to just create a new controller and an action that will be called, like say we added webhooks/deleted or something up here, and we call our webhooks controller with the deleted action. And that would work perfectly well. But there's another approach that the .NET SDK also provides, which is using ASP.NET Core middleware. So let's jump back in our code here. And let's actually get rid of everything for now. And close a couple of folders here. And let's open our startup.cs instead. And what we'll do here is we'll tell our app to use the middleware supplied by the SDK. And that is done in the configure method down here. So we go app.use contentful webhooks. And that lives in the ASP.NET Core middleware namespace. And then we go consumers. There. And you'll notice that this pattern is exactly the same that is used down here by the app.use MVC middleware, because that's all that MVC really is. It's just middleware with some registered services sprinkled on top, so we're doing basically the same thing here. Okay, so now the middleware is registered, and the next step is to actually add a couple of consumers, so consuming code for the webhook. So let's do that, consumers.add consumer. And this might look a little bit weird to begin with, but it's actually quite straightforward. We'll go through it step by step. Oopsie. There we go. So firstly, the add consumer method that we use here is generic. And that is so you'll be able to tell this consumer what type of object you expect it to receive. Because every time a webhook is triggered in Contentful, there is a JSON payload that is sent with it. So in the case of a published entry, for example, it's the entry that will be sent as a payload. So in our case, we could actually use entry dynamic for simplicity. And the next parameter here is, as we'll see here, is the name, and that is the name of the webhook. So if we go back here, it's this name right here. So we're telling the .NET SDK which webhook to listen for. And we can also use a wildcard here to say just listen to any webhook. And the next parameter here, excuse me, is topic type, which is content type entry or asset. In our case, we want the webhook to be triggered for only entry, so we add that. And the final string here is topic action, which is which type of topic action you want this consumer to be triggered for. And this corresponds to, if we go back to the web app here, this is the topic type, so content type entry or asset, and this here are the topic actions, so create, save, archive, etc. So we could, if we go back to Visual Studio again, we could just go here, delete, for example. But in our case, we just say any action, or yeah, any action. And the final parameter here, this one, is actually the consumer. And this is just that takes a parameter of our generic type from over here. So we can see here that S is actually entry dynamic and returns an object, any object. And this will then be used in the Contentful overview of the webhook. And in the body of this method, I can do whatever action I want when this hook is triggered. Maybe I need to evict something from the cache, or maybe I need to send an email notification to someone, or post something to Slack, or whatever you want. And you of course don't have to inline your func like this. You could just as well pass any method. So let's just create a method down here. Let's call it just something like that, and then we can just pass that method in as the parameter here. And we can of course also add multiple consumers. So this is the consumer for one webhook. We can just add another one if we would like to. Trigger this for anything, for any type, but only for deletes, for example. And return nothing. So we can have as many consumers as we need, because we can have multiple webhooks triggering for different type of events. And to show you this in action, we're going to trigger a very simple webhook call through Postman down here. So here we can see the call that I'm making. I'm passing a couple of headers here, and these headers are always supplied to webhooks called by Contentful. It's the topic. Here we can see it's an entry that has been published, and this is the name of our webhook. And then if we have a look at the body here, we can see that I'm just passing a JSON payload of a contentful entry here. So if we send this, we also need to save our startup, of course. There we go. Let's try that again. We can see that we get our JSON test hello back here. That actually maps to this part here. So if I change this to something else, let's say I grab something from the entry, maybe name and US English, something like that. And if we now run that again in Postman, we'll see we get that back. So that's the name in ENUS. So that's a pretty nice and simple way to get webhooks up and running quickly. You can also add authorization to your webhooks if you would like to. So we can go here, consumers webhook authorization. And this is also a func, so we could just go here false. And this func here takes the HTTP context as a parameter, and that means that you can do any kind of checking of headers or whatever you want to make sure that the request that is incoming is authorized. But if I change this to false here and run this again, then I'll, as you can see here, I'll run into 401 unauthorized. And if I turn that back to true, send again, we'll be back to working again. Okay, so that's webhooks. And one final thing I thought I'd show you today is how to work with localization. So let's go back to it. And the first thing we need to do to get that working is we need to turn localization on for our little application. And to do that, we again need to register some services. And just keep in mind that this has nothing to do with Contentful or the SDK. This first part here is just the normal ASP.NET Core configuration that needs to be done in order to get localization working. So let's go back here to our startup.cs and up to the services, and we'll add some new services in here. There we go. And let's add our using statements for globalization and for ASP.NET localization. Okay, and what we've done here is we've added some options for configuring localization, namely which cultures we support in ENUS, SVSE, and Norwegian. So that's English, American English, and Swedish and Norwegian. Then we use these options when we add localization to the middleware pipeline, which we do down here. And we need to add another using statement down there. So first we get our options, and then we tell the app to use request localization. And this injects the localization into the middleware pipeline and will by default configure localization based on the accept language HTTP header, the query string, or through cookies. So those three different ways to specify your culture just gets added out of the box with this configuration. And again, keep in mind this has nothing to do with Contentful. This is just ASP.NET Core configuration. Okay, so now we have localization configured for our application, and now we can come back to our index action in our products controller here and tell Contentful to use that culture. So let's first here just get the current culture. So culture we'll call it, and that would be culture info dot current culture. And then we can just add to our query builder here, locale is culture in culture to string. And now if we go back to our application here and run our index action again here for products, we can see that it has already switched over to Swedish for me, and that is because the ASP.NET Core localization feature will actually look at the exact language header, like I said previously, to figure out which culture to use. But we can also use the query string, so we can override this quite easily by doing something like this, culture and we can see it turns back into English again. And locales are pretty powerful in Contentful, as you can configure fallback chains, so you can have one locale fall back to another if a translation is missing, for example, for a certain field. And if I change my culture to Norwegian up here, that is exactly what we can see happening here. We can see the title for the cup here is in Norwegian, but the other titles stay in Swedish, as that is the fallback language configured for Norwegian. So let's go back to Swedish here again quickly and compare. So these three does not change, but this one does. Okay, so now we have a product catalog with localization and some webhooks. All in not much more than an hour, I think. Many thanks for listening, and we hope you enjoyed it.